and others, they need like kind of a core person, and then they also need another group of people, like more an extension. I was just curious on thoughts on that, as far as if it's like how people are wired. Some people um, have different aloneness needs as far as group oriented, like a bigger group, or more focused in on one person or a small group. And so I was curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever attributed that to anything other than maybe personality, temperament. Some people tend to relate and feel connected in groups and feel very energized in a context where there's lots of people expressing care and connection. They just really feel like that's a significant way that they receive life is in larger groups. Cindy would be significantly more that way than I am, versus the more introverted person who would bring life from having one or two or three, or even the way that when you're having conversation, if there's a lot going on, to be able to focus on individuals. Um, in some ways, for me, the way I experience life and relationship is most often I'm encouraged when there's some level of depth or opportunity for connection, and I recognize that other people, as long as they're around people, they just really feel like they belong to something, and it's very life giving to them. And those are really lonely places for me if I don't have a means to connect at a deeper level. And so I think there's a huge variety of ways that we experience it, and for it's imperative for us to understand the way we receive life and be able to communicate that to the people around us, and not say, well, you should be this way or you should be that way. And honestly, that was one of the things that Cindy and I had to work through. She'd tell you that she just kind of judged me because I had to recharge either alone or in very small groups, and that's when I was beginning my life as a pastor and ministering to people. And she goes, you're just in sin. And I go, no, I got to recharge you. And she eventually came over to the right side of the force and accepted me the way I am. But I think that's just what we have to be, why we have to be students of the people we're responsible to love and to ourselves, and be able to communicate it. And I don't know if there's a easy, this is always true. It's finding those ways that we do engage and find life and caring for each other that way.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It is challenging to understand other people,
Yeah.
to even understand ourselves, and then to be like, appreciate someone else in a different way.
Yeah.
Another thing I would love just to kick around a little bit, I think you alluded to it a little bit, I forget the context, but just kind of the, I guess the sexualization of relational needs. And I think, Paul kind of says you've lost sensitivity and turned it into sensuality or something to that effect. But I think because we don't have a good context for healthy care for one another, it can often become really sexualized, where it's like, if anyone does anything that's loving, it can get twisted into like a sexualized. And also even that, I think a lot of times people don't know how to experience intimacy apart from sexuality. And now on the other side of that, like even thinking of my own marriage, in times when our communication and emotional connection was really poor, it seemed like our sexual life together helped sustain us through that time when our other expressions weren't. So I guess I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on I guess one is kind of the perversion of that, where everything's become sexual, and then one is the blessing of that, where sexuality actually helps maintain an intimacy that I don't know, we might not know how to express in other ways. So
Yeah. Yeah. And if you other guys have thoughts or anything on this, feel free to jump in. But I guess I would just say it's part of the fallen way we live now in culture, even in, like, we live in a highly sexualized culture. Everything, marketing, everything it's right up on top. I'm not sure pushing it back down means it's not going to be overly sexualized, because you go to places in Asia, as an example, where the norm would not be this overt sexualization culture. Well, it's still pressing on people's behavior, and having mistresses, or the immorality, I don't think is any different. I don't think it's maybe among the young it might be. It's not validated in high school in some Asian cultures, and so I think there is a safeguard in that. But we live it right up on top, and that is it has been distorted. Meaningful connection is always expressed in a sexual way, and so even two men who love each other, you wonder, you read some of David and Jonathan's, conversations, and because of the culture we live in, we go, wow, that just sounds wrong, but it's perfectly appropriate because it has nothing to do with the sexual connotation. But I would say that maybe the most damaging thing I see is that young women use their bodies to try to establish relational connection, and not that they're not sexual beings, or that it's only that for them, but that a lot of damage is done because there is no means. Maybe in family there's not enough care and delight and of our daughters, and so learning how to take these tools and build that care and connection into our kids, so that they're not out there looking for a way to feel meaningfully connected. And I would just say that sin impacts that desire so greatly. I think it affects sexuality. I think it affects gangs and the desire to be a part of something, to be significant in a relationship, to feel a part of something. Men and women will join gangs and do horrendous things, and it seems like the primary motivation, maybe it's safety, maybe it's greed for stuff, but it sure seems like there's a brotherhood or a fellowship of a gang that's really, really attractive. And so that's one of the I think it's just part of what we have to be able to speak into in the broken ways our culture responds relationally, and give them something to be jealous of in faith-based care and relationship. I do believe that's one of the reasons John 17, the qualifier that Jesus gives, that the whole world's gonna know you're mine if you do this well. That it's so distinct from everybody wanting something, lording it over, leaders lording over, manipulating, grabbing, just all of that is just so broken in the world, that an example of genuine love and relationship is just so different, and I believe so attractive. How many of our testimonies would start with, I saw the love of the church and it was very attractive to me. So I think it's everywhere, and it's true, and it's obvious, but I think we have the answer to be presenting an alternative. In terms of the other one, it's one of the reasons I think marriage is so important to healthy marriage is so important to making disciples. Is the way we express that oneness and care for one another, when it is beautiful, when it is working, when it is, even if we're struggling, God has given us mechanisms to care for one another. Any physical touch between lovers creates hormones of connection and a sense of well-being. I think it's the oxytocin that's released when we have this sense of sharing something significant, and even if it's in that moment mostly physical and not particularly relational connection, there's still positive things that happen that God's built into us, so that we can say there is an us, there is a we that I can retreat to and feel safe and cared for. And so I certainly think that it's way better to err on the side of more touch, more care, more connection, and build that health into one another, even if it's not perfect. Because without it, I think what I see is men and women retreating, looking for other ways to find that connection or significance. I think that's what happens in affairs. I think that's why so many people are driven to trade their souls for their careers or for things. is we've not really given many healthy ways to express care and connection that goes, I don't really care what you think. And there is a place we can feel important and special and cared for that gives us a different face towards the world. So again, we don't get into in the content that we're working with. As you're working with couples, presenting this information in local church context or wherever you might do it, building it into disciples. The reason we start with this foundation is so that we can go from this understanding of God's intention, that it's care and connection, it matters to Him, and then we move through these skills, and when those two things are in place, we can talk about anything. Now we can talk about sex and money and in-laws and whatever it is, because now we have healthy ways. Well, what's the goal here? Well, it's to stay connected, not for you to get your way or for me to get my way. Or what about sex? Well, as long as the goal is for us to work together, to be connected, to be like-minded, and we see the care piece, and we have the tools of doing, sharing what's important to us and reconciling and apologizing, whatever we need to do. Now we have the tools to talk about any subject. So we don't emphasize those subjects, but the tools, I believe, set up any conversation you want to have with anybody. If you can establish care as the standard, connection and care as the standard, you can broach any subject, and people will, it'll feel safe, at least safe enough to talk about, versus the walls coming up and go, nope, I'm not talking about that. That's why we work so hard at this is the conviction, this is what God wants, and here's how we're going to get there with these particular skills. It might be a longer answer than you wanted, but
No, that was good. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wanted to chime in on that. I was really struck, and that's what it was. It was your comment that sometimes it's harder for men to find affection in our culture apart from sexuality.
Yep.
And even as our church has been grieving together, the girls are like hugging each other and laying on each other's laps and holding hands and rubbing each other's legs, and the guys are, just we're just not allowed to connect in that way. And just
little soldiers.
Yeah, we're little soldiers, so we show each other affection, but we're not allowed to do it that way because we don't know appropriate ways. And hopefully there is some, our physical intimacy is kind of only with our wife. We have this little window of, so it's interesting.
Yeah, and I do think as you grow the culture of care and safety and that it's not weird, I do think it becomes more and more appropriate. And sometimes it's generational. I think the young guys are a lot more comfortable expressing hugs. And again, I don't think they're going to walk down the street holding hands, most Westerners anyway. But there are cultures that do that, where men walk down the street holding hands, and it's very brotherly, and it's just that's the way they demonstrate, hey, we care for each other, we're friends. But I do think you can build that into a culture, and I would say I would say locally, in our local context, I would say most men they'd be pretty comfortable, grieving aggressively in each other's, in an embrace that would say, I got you. You go ahead and cry. You go ahead and you let it out. And I think that would be true. Maybe not everyone. I don't know if you ever get to that universal place, but I do think it can improve even for men. But to just recognize as you're teaching this, that's a very important subject. We're spending some time with Rich's world down there with some guys, and for some of them, it's just a really hard thing to think about. They tease each other. Well, he doesn't like hugs. Well, we'll see. We'll see 2 years from now. We'll see if that gets and it may not, but it might, because that's typically true, that guys get more comfortable saying, no, I feel secure, I feel known enough, I feel safe enough, that I can actually share a hug or appropriate affectionate embrace. But heading into it, I would say just to be really mindful of that most men feel pretty starved for a way to physically touch and feel okay about it, except with their wives. And so if that's not healthy, if the physical relationship with their wife isn't healthy, they can really feel isolated and hurting So just something to be mindful as you're teaching it, listening for. Um, it's one of the reasons Cindy and I have just chosen where we are going to have active PDAs wherever we are. It's just this is normal. This is you are. If the whole world gets to put it on the movie screen, then you're going to watch us. Um, trying to not to get too aggressive in public, but no promises.
I wondered, Pat, if it'd be helpful just to share kind of those three core brain chemistry chemicals. So you talked about oxytocin, and then there's
Yeah.
also dopamine and cortisol, and just how those interweave a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not as there's serotonin, I believe, and cortisol, which I'm not as familiar with. They have different functions. All I just know is as a culture, what we tend to spend our time and our money and our energy pursuing are things that would lead to dopamine hits, big adventures, big things that are and dopamine is released when you have something that is exciting and fun or pleasant. You can eat great food and you can have this, wow, that was amazing, but it quickly fades away and doesn't lead to long-term happiness. It's kind of like that new car thing. You get in, it smells great, this is awesome, you buy the new thing, even with you get your kids this new toy and they're so excited, they're so emotional, and it just goes away and you go, oh, well, now it's laying in the yard rusting. Those tend to lead to dopamine, and as a culture, that's what we tend to emphasize. And so I think we do that relationally. You know, a new person, a new adventure, some new sexual experience or relational experience, because it gives us that dopamine hit. The oxytocin is released when we have a sense of care and connection in meaningful relationship. And that's what actually, it is a long-term effect that leads to a long-term sense of safety and security and connection, especially, and as we start working through the skills and we get into this idea of being empathetic and how critical that is to us feeling connected, especially going through difficult things. If we can do that connected to someone, expressing care back and forth, it's just like the mother lode of oxytocin that leads to this long-term sense of well-being. And so, as a culture, I would say, yeah, just an observation. I can't say for every person, but as a culture, I'd say we tend to emphasize those things that will give us that dopamine hit. And it's all over the place. It can be as simple as somebody liked a tweet you sent. You go, oh yeah, I like that. Do that again. And we go looking for that little sense of good versus a friend or your wife or husband or whatever, just putting their arm around you, going, I'm with you in this. And it gives us this long-term sense of good and care. And so for me, that's really cool because that's God built into our very physiology, our brain chemistry, what he says is valuable. The short-term pleasure will not lead to long-term gain. It's being a person of character, being a person that is expressing and receiving care and dependable, and all the proverbial wisdom about what it means to be a noble person having a good reputation. It depends on that relational kind of idea. So, and if you have thoughts on the other two, those are the two I tend to talk about. So I'm not going to talk out of turn on the others. They have significant impact, but where I tend to live is those two, choosing that long-term connection over that short-term buzz.
Yeah, the only thought, cortisol would be what you would maybe call the stress hormone or the stress
Yeah,
steroid. So
yeah,
anytime you're feeling stress or a lot of anxiety, a lot of pressure, it releases cortisol, which actually like brings inflammation into your body and all these things. And so I would second what Pat says. I'd say basically our culture does one of two things, and they usually work together. We'll relieve your cortisol. We'll relieve all that stress and feelings of anxiety and overwhelmedness by giving you tons of dopamine hits. By eating lots of cotton candy and going on roller coasters and all the crazy stuff. And so, just that, like Pat said, that God built our brain chemistry with the opportunity to connect, but it's not going to come by us trying to always relieve stress through quick hit fixes, but through long-term care.
Yeah, I may come back and encourage just walk through some of those brain chemistry ones in one of these sessions, because I do think it is really fascinating. The book, The Other Half of Church, deals with some of it. It's one of those I recommended. There's a little app called Staying in Love While Parenting. Did I say that right? That they've got a few videos that really, and that's a secular resource, but they do a great job of explaining what's going on. And so if I'm remembering right, I'm not a brain scientist, but I love thinking I am. The cortisol, isn't that when something is kind of uncertain or unsettled, that creates that anxiety? So
Yeah.
here's the deal. If we don't feel connected, if we're not sure where we stand relationally with people, we're not just not experiencing oxytocin, but we're also experiencing that added sense of, hey, anxiety. Well, what's wrong? It should lead us to make different decisions, because the anxiety should lead us to something, but it usually leads us to seek dopamine or food or something, not what we're really longing for, which is a sense of connection. So.